Yeah, I'm the last speaker of the afternoon session. The title is, now keep in mind this is to help people want to listen to it, right? The Baptist pastor and his transgender friends. Yes. Well, that's the theme of the whole thing, is the knowledge. Yeah. So, So what I'm doing in the TED Talk is I'm just talking about the experience I've had writing that column and all the people I've met and what I've learned from that. That's all that it is, right? Yeah. Donna?
Say that again, it's an echo back here.
Hey, you want to turn it down just a much?
The name of it is...
The next, so this is the TEDx in Charlottesville, Virginia, and the theme of the whole thing is the power of one. We had to come up with a title for my speech that's 40 characters or less to fit within their format. So that's the issue. And so the Baptist pastor and his transgender friends. Because I'm talking about all the people I've met through this and how they've befriended me and taught me about their lives. So that's what this is about.
Will you be back?
Yes, ma'am. Yes. Yeah, we'll come back Saturday. If I could. Okay, well, so welcome. Yes. I'll post a link on Facebook. It will be live streamed, I'm told.
But then they'll also record it.
Which means, all of these are recorded and you can watch it later. Yeah, there's another TEDx happening at SMU on Saturday. So these are regional events.
Do you get invited to do this, or do you have to apply? How does that work?
Most people apply. I was invited. Yeah, I would have never done that stuff this for myself. Yeah, and just, who knew, right? I've never had anything go crazy like that. I've been writing in the public sphere for 35 years now, and never had an experience like this before. So, it's at the site baptistnews.com. That's yeah.
And the newspaper here in Dallas.
No problem. Yeah, the Charlotte Observer also picked it up. Okay, we've got a lot of ground to cover today, and thank you all for being here. So last week we began the lesson, and for the benefit of anyone who wasn't here, we have handouts. And by the way, if you picked up a fresh handout today, when I copied it this time, I got one of the pages reversed. All the context there is just that the biblical passages start page earlier than they should, and you have to look at that. So, if you think it's out of order and you're crazy, it's not you, it's me, right? And we've got extra handouts in that. So last week we began a conversation. Again, my disclaimer of all of this is this was not of my preference or instigation here. I don't know what I did to my keys. Oh well, I think I just walked in the office. Too many accessories today. I'm responding to the series of questions that have been asked as we took up discussing the passage from 2 Peter about false teachers and false teachers, and that led to a conversation about the issue that we're dealing with today in our church, and that led to another question about marriage and what that means and all that. So last week we ran through a lengthy history of marriage. Welcome, come in, unless you're looking for the tour. And where we left off last week is on the page that says, what does the Bible say about marriage? All right. So again, this is not Mark's attempt for worldwide dominion on this subject. This is in response to a question that asked. Just deal with the whole issue of marriage. And so we set some context for that last week with the history, and you can read a lot of the bullet points of that on the handout there as well. So we were getting into the biblical texts. And one of the things I said last week is it's been my impression that some of us think that the script for a wedding is in the Bible somewhere. And the reality is that no, not so much. We owe much of that language that's used in a traditional wedding ceremony. Now, I'm going to talk about a traditional wedding ceremony. There's all sorts of variations on this, right? People write their own vows and do all sorts of crazy things and all that. But the traditional wedding ceremony language that we are most accustomed to hearing really dates back to England around the time of Henry VIII. And it was canonized in the Book of Common Prayer by the Anglican Church, which we know in America as the Episcopal Church, which was the breakaway from the Catholic Church when Henry VIII couldn't get done by the Pope what he wanted done and all that. And so it's a messy, messy thing. But some good came out of that, and we got some beautiful language out of that we use. So what does the Bible say about marriage? So we began talking last week out of Genesis chapter 1, and this is a passage that you see before you that you've heard before. And I want to remind you that we've got two passages from Genesis because there are two creation stories in Genesis, not just one. And we've studied this before as well. In the first Genesis passage, Genesis chapter 1, there's much more equality between male and female. It's only in Genesis 2 that we find the female created after the male, right? Now, so much we could say, and I don't want to delve down into a deep dive on the interpretation of all of Genesis here. But remember that we've had previous conversations. There are multiple ways to read Genesis. Some people read it as a literal Adam and Eve, two literal people who God created and started the earth and so forth and so on. Other people read this as representative of, so the language in Hebrew is Adam and Adamah, which means male and female. There is other language that's used, particularly in Genesis 1, that's about humans, that's not gender specific. So all of this is mixed in there, and it gets lost in our English translations. But just understand that there are multiple ways of looking at this, and I've just given you a couple of those there. So I gave you some homework last week, and I asked you to think about this passage that said, where God told them in verse 28, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it." We traditionally, our first line reading of that is procreation, right? This is a command to procreate and fill the earth with human beings, which certainly happened. However it happened, right? And we are the result of that in some way or another. But is it possible that this also could have more meaning than just procreation? What are other ways that we as humans can be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it? What have you thought of this week out of this? Ideas?
Well, one thing that comes to me is subdue. We think of the Garden of Eden, everything is perfect and wonderful. You're supposed to subdue. There must have been some things that weren't so easy to, it wasn't just, bonbon eating and there had to be something more to life if you're subduing nature.
I don't think the bonbon had been created yet, but this is an excellent point that Helen makes. She's saying if the command is to subdue the earth, well, think about what happens when anyone tend a garden? So if this is the Garden of Eden, right? Can you just let your garden run wild? No. It's the worst thing you could possibly do for your garden, other than pouring Spectracide all over it or something, right? It requires tending. And tending your garden is a way of subduing the earth and managing it. It's not a bad thing. Subdue here is not a bad word. It's really a management kind of word. Yeah. What are some other ideas on?
So were there weeds and thorns before the fall?
Oh, here's Darrell with our great question of the day. Were there weeds and thorns before the fall? What do y'all think? Are weeds and thorns the result of sin in the world, or were they created by God beforehand? Talitha says they were there ahead of time. Now, mosquitoes, I'm sure, are a result of the fall. Can't speak to the weeds and thorns, but mosquitoes, no contest.
Is the word subdued translated from Hebrew, whatever language? I wonder about that word. I wonder why it's translated as subdued.
And I wish I could answer that. I can go read on that. I don't know right off the top of my head the answer to that question. Yeah. My impression is that it is most likely a word that is just what we're saying, to bring under control, right? To manage.
Well, I wonder about, the first thing I thought was animals that we haven't cared for or that we overuse that are extinct. Now, I mean like good.
Right. So, interesting thing, one of the cutting edges of the environmentalist movement in the world today is among evangelical Christians, young evangelical Christians. And the reason is they go back to Genesis right here with the same idea that God has given us dominion over the earth to manage it well. And so there is this rebellion in young evangelical circles against the notion that we just need to use up all the resources of here because God's given them to us to use. So it's a really interesting thing that's going on here. Think about some other ways that you might be fruitful beyond procreating with children. How else are we fruitful? Doing good things. Working. Yes. Creativity. How about the ways that we're creative and we're fruitful? In our relationships, we're fruitful. How about someone who doesn't have children of their own, who has no biological children? Can they fulfill this command? How? Okay, adoption, foster care is one way. What else? Being a hospital chaplain. Yeah, caring for the people around you. There is a parenting spirit and a caring spirit that I think fulfills this. And I think all of us know people who've not had children of their own, but have been some of the most nurturing people we've ever known in our lives, because it's just who they are, right? And so for them, school teachers are a great example of that as well. Okay, so we see here that God blessed them, said that they were good. There is no indication of a wedding here. Now, but I think, would generally agree that in this story that we understand about Adam and Eve, who are not named in the same way in Genesis chapter 1, that they were a couple, right? And if they did, we don't know. Yeah. There is no evidence, really, and through a lot of ancient history, of weddings the way we know them today. Well, you could say that, I guess. I'm not saying that. Right. So we talked about that language that's used in a traditional wedding ceremony. Where does it, even though it's not ripped straight out of, God did not give Moses the command to say, and when thou marriest, thou sayest, dearly beloved, we are gathered here today. So
Henry VIII is still doing his work.
Well, but all of the ideas in the traditional wedding ceremony really come from Scripture. And they come from the history of the Christian church. So they're not just rooted in nothing. They're just not, it's not a script given right out of the Bible. But there's a lot of Bible in a wedding ceremony.
Yes.
It's just sort of pieced together in different ways, right?
But Jesus didn't even care for this sermon. He just came for the party.
Jesus, well, he might have been there for the sermon. We don't know.
No, it's a party part for him.
The only part that got reported was the party.
But wine,
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that. So chapter 2, verse 18, here's the second story of creation. The Lord said, "It is not good that the man," created, Adam is the Hebrew word, "should be alone. I will make a helper as his partner." So out of the ground the Lord formed every animal of the field and every bird of the air and brought them to the man to see what he would call them, and so forth and so on. No one was found suitable to be his partner. So the Lord God caused him to fall into a sleep, took one of his ribs, closed up the place of flesh, and out of this he brought woman, Adamah, so same root word, feminine instead of male, right? And brought her to the man. And the man said, "This is at last bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for out of man this one was taken." And here's the verse that most of us get caught up on. "Therefore, a man leaves his father and his mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh." So, many of us will say, well, there's the wedding language. That's marriage right there, isn't it? Because we talk about that. Think about the whole context of this passage from Genesis chapter 2 and what's being done here. What is the purpose of the story in Genesis 2? It's really to tell us about relationship and how God created us and loves us and wants us to be in relationship with God. Whether you believe that God physically took a rib out of a man and made a woman out of it, or whether this is a symbolic story to help us understand the way God has created. And in this room, we're going to have those two views and probably a lot of stuff in between about how you're going to read this passage from Genesis.
Mark, I was sitting here thinking, this is kind of off the subject, but this is big. Okay. It said that he made all the animal stuff out of mud.
Yes.
And I was thinking about that in terms of people who believe the Bible is literal.
Yes.
I mean, they really believe that God made patty cakes, you know, and made that many for a man, made this and made that and that. So therefore, this other part that follows can be not literal.
Well, yeah, it's a great point that Pat's making. You can quickly back yourself into a corner if you're too overly literal in reading Genesis. And again, I'm going to take the view that this is instruction. It is inspired religious instruction to help us understand that God is the creator. That in ways that we may not understand, God has created all that is. That's the most important thing we've got to affirm. How God did it is not really my concern, so much as that God did it. And that's what I want to affirm. So we get to verse 24. Here's a story. Now keep in mind how the Old Testament was written. It came out of oral tradition. So for thousands of years, these stories were handed down by oral tradition, and they eventually get written down the way the story is told. And you can see that this is a teaching story, right? This is the kind of story that you would tell children to help them understand their religious training from a very early age, probably. And here's a moral. What is the moral of this story? It is that a man leaves his father and his mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh. Well, now what's curious about that is throughout different eras of history, sometimes this has been reversed. Sometimes it is the woman who leaves family and clings to the husband and his family in a patriarchal society. Now, if you read some of the Old Testament stories of the early patriarchs, you'll see situations where the males go find a spouse and maybe sojourn among that wife's family for a period of time. But we see it the other way as well. So I think this, even in our culture, we don't see this happening this way all the time. A lot of it depends upon family dynamics and location, right? Sometimes the man is leaving father and mother and clinging to the wife and her family. Other times we see this happen the opposite way. And those of you who have adult children can speak to this, right? I mean, you know that this happens different ways. This is a statement that probably had its roots in this kind of culture where the major part of what's happening in a marriage is property rights. And you're expanding your property rights. Recall we talked about that last week. Okay, while that's true, what does this verse say to us today? We can understand maybe where it's come from. What do we take away from it today? And here's where I need your help. Donna?
Well, what I get out of it is that in marriage, you're in relationship with another person. And so you commit so wholeheartedly to that person that even your own family takes a back seat to building your relationship with this other person.
Well, I think if you've ever done any marriage counseling, this is like way up at the list on that. You've got to put your attention on the new relationship more than on the family relationship. Now, you can't kill off the family relationship. Your family is your family, whether you like them or not, right? You can't get rid of them. Not that easily, right? And how many marriages have been set up for failure because of meddling parents? Anyone want to testify?
Family dynamics, how am I going to handle this? What about the brother who's at the wrong Thanksgiving dinner? So it's, yes, I see it all the time.
Could y'all hear Susan? Okay.
And because of meddling parents, that's why people elope.
That's why, yeah. Well, it's as a parent, I would say it would be cheaper to elope than to do a wedding. Right? Would you agree, Chris? It would be cheaper if they eloped?
Because I experienced that as a young bride, and it brought up faith.
Right.
Because it was so drastic. Back in those days, it was, you got to do this, no choice. And so meddlesome parents are not always a good thing.
So I think one of the big points of this verse 24 is it's talking about the relationship when two people come together to form a new family, they're forming a new family. Oh, what about arranged? Well, all of these were arranged marriages at that time, right? So there wasn't anything other than that. And I know that's foreign to us today, but even in those arranged marriages, you had to create a new household, right? In some cultures, that was a household rooted in the woman's family, and others, it was rooted in the man's family. The parents. Both. Yeah. So if you're a parent of a boy, you're looking for the right woman, and if you're the parent of a girl, and the parents get together. Yeah, it's a business deal. And those still happen. Okay, so, but this is a beautiful passage from Genesis that we'll sometimes still use in a wedding today, right? Because it indicates something. Now, I'll tell you one of my pet peeves, that anytime I'm counseling a couple that I'm going to marry, we don't see this done as much anymore, but anyone have a unity candle at your wedding? You know what a unity candle is? Right, so a unity candle is along the eastern coast, there's a sand ceremony that you do right? Where you mix up sand and whatever. Well, this is another variation on that where you have an unlit candle in the middle, and you have a candle over here and a candle. This represents the groom's family. It's lit. And like the mother of the groom comes and lights this at the beginning. And then you have a candle over here that represents the bride's family, and the mother of the bride or the father, someone comes and lights that as it's the beginning. And at some point during the ceremony, the bride and the groom, as they're being married, take the flame from their respective candles of their families and light the new candle in the middle to demonstrate that they are now coming alive, right, as a new family, which is sweet. We had this at our wedding as well. The advice, though, and I learned this from a seminary professor who taught all of us when we were going to be, dealing with weddings, do not let them blow out the candles. Because the symbolism, you just killed off your family. Now, I know some people may want to. I understand that. Let the groom get hold of that, the bride's family candle. Snuff it out. The reality is that you carry your family with you wherever you go, and you're not going to get rid of it. And so what you're symbolizing in that is that two households have come together into one, but you put the lit candles back because those families still stay there, right? They don't go away. Now, if you blew out the candles at your wedding ceremony, it's okay. I absolve you of all of that. If it created family conflict, well, okay. Does that make sense? What else about these two Genesis passages before we move on? Okay.
What do you do with your candle? Do you lit? You share it with
Well, it stays lit during the ceremony, and then eventually it has to be blown out, and then you put it in a box somewhere and you hold on to it for 30 years. With the piece of frozen wedding cake, right? We actually took ours out, I think, each anniversary for a year or two. Or maybe for the month, I don't know. But we were so poor, having a candle light was, that was a real highlight. We could afford a match. All right. Next, we move to the New Testament and look at 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And this is the Apostle Paul writing to the church at Corinth. Now, concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is well for a man not to touch a woman. But because of cases of sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights. Do I need to define conjugal for anyone? Okay, good. And likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a set time, to devote yourselves to prayer, and then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. This I say by way of concession, not of command. I wish that all were as I myself am. But each has a particular gift from God, one having another kind and another a different kind. To the unmarried and the widows I say that it is well for them to remain unmarried as I am, but if they are not practicing self-control, they should marry. And here's the famous verse, for it is better to marry than to be aflame with passion. This is the Elvis verse. Hunka hunka burning love, right here. I'm sure it is. I just made that up, but I think it works, right? So what's happening here is Paul is speaking to the early church, and they all believe the return of Christ is imminent. Like any day. It would have blown their minds to know that we'd still be here 2,000 years later, looking for the return of Christ. That was not within their realm of understanding at all. And Paul is writing to them about the urgency of living life for the Messiah and what that means. And so he's saying, essentially, if you're already married, stay married. If you're not yet married, don't get married unless you just can't control yourself. So what we see from this passage is a couple of things that we can imply from the early church. Whatever has happened along the way, by this point, we see emerging a sexual ethic that implies, it's not stated, but it implies sexual relationships within the context of marriage. Now, that would not always have been the case, certainly in world history, and maybe not even, certainly not within Judaism. Look at the Old Testament and all that goes on there. What King David got in trouble for was not for having multiple sexual partners, but for wanting someone who belonged to someone else. And in that case, in a sense of being property, really, right? So here by the New Testament era, by the first century, we seem to have some sense of a one-on-one relationship and sexual relations within the context of marriage, whatever marriage is at that point. There is really no story I can think of in the Bible that would show us what a marriage would have been like in that culture. We do have the wedding at Cana that we'll talk about in just a moment, but that really is about the party, not about the wedding. But so you can read between the lines here and see this. Paul's message is about self-control. It's about self-control. So that is a kind of mindset that certainly has carried over into a lot of American culture, that if you can't control yourself, get married, which is not always a good way to get married. Right? Well, keep in mind, love is a late 18th century construct that's come to us, right? Because everything else before that was an arranged kind of marriage. It was for something other than love. But we think of it as for love, and that's great, because I think we're in a good place on that. I'm not saying don't do that. Paul's advice is really a very practical bit. What else do you read, or might you imply from this 1 Corinthians passage? Or what questions does it raise for you? Insights, questions, comments? Help us out here. Okay.
If he's saying don't get married as the first order, was that what set up the priesthood for the Catholic Church?
Okay, so here's a great question from Harriet. If he's saying, first of all, don't get married, is this what set up the priesthood, the unmarried priesthood for the Catholic Church? I don't know the answer to that. Does anyone know? I've not done enough study on the origin. Now, keep in mind that early on in Catholicism, priests were married. It's not always been that way. That came later, and I don't know enough about the history of that. Does anyone know more about your Catholic history?
So if you look at the history of it, a lot of it had to do with when a priest would die, his wife would get money from that, and that was taking money away from the church. And so the church actually stopped them being married. So
Could y'all hear that? Interesting. You ask a great question. It's all about money eventually. Yeah, follow the money. Follow the money. Someone's going to say something over here.
This is kind of off subject, but Apostle Paul doesn't seem faithful with it. So he's always kind of putting the whole blanket on.
Yeah, so, and dissertations and books and reams of paper have been expended on Paul's view of women. And it's one of those deals where it depends on which side of the mountain you look at, what you see, right? So, by some accounts, Paul hates women. By other accounts, Paul is really ahead of his time in that culture with women. The truth's probably somewhere in between, right?
I think Paul as being so in love with Christ, so to speak, but I think that earlier. But he was so on fire for getting his message out there. It's kind of like that was his goal, you know. So women were just kind of out there somewhere. I don't think he was against women, so it was just in their time.
Well, certainly we do see Paul has a lot of zeal, and he believes Christ is coming again. Everything has to be focused on that. So there is no sense, in his view at this point, of an ordinary kind of life. Everything about your life needs to be devoted to this. Donna?
If you look at some of his specific writings, like in Corinthians, where he's admonishing the church, it's in turmoil, he gives some instruction not only for men, but for women, how they should act, men, older women, younger women, and so forth and so on. And that was in order to keep chaos out of the church. Not so much I'm against or for.
Right, he was just trying to keep people.
Yeah, and if you look, Phoebe was a deaconess, and you can go on and on to the women that helped Paul, and were just, so I think that you're right, both ends. But I think it's more cultural for Paul in his day to get the message out.
So there's a sense that we're going to find multiple places in Scripture where marriage is a necessary construct to put some boundaries on behavior. It is about relationship, yes, and we find that from Genesis forward. But from a social issue, imagine the chaos that results in a community of faith or a community of any kind when there are no agreed upon boundaries on a sexual ethic, right? Then it's like 5th or 6th grade all over again, but with more mature people, right? One of my favorite sayings is there's nothing meaner than a 6th grade girl. She's sweet. Yeah, there's some, because girls mature faster than boys, and there's something happens around the 5th or 6th grade where, and the boys are oblivious, to what's going on. They catch up later, and, there's nothing weirder than a 7th grade boy. And I speak from personal experience all the way around, right? Ephesians chapter 5. Now here's the one that you really know about, right? Because we've heard so much about Ephesians chapter 5. And it begins with verse 21. Now, sometimes people skip verse 21 because it doesn't help their point. But we need to include verse 21. Be subject to one another, mutual, out of reverence for Christ. Let's pause. This is a mutual submission, a mutual reverence to each other as a couple, not because one is superior to the other, but out of reverence for Christ. That is the thesis statement for what's to follow. Everything else hangs on that. Wives, be subject to your husbands as you are to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, just as Christ is the head of the church, the body of which he is the Savior. And just as the church is subject to Christ, so also wives ought to be in everything to their husbands. Verse 25, husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her in order to make her holy by cleansing her with the washing of the water by the word, and so forth and so on. You can keep reading that. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as they do their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself, for no one ever hates his own body, but he nourishes and tenderly cares for it. I think that's not a true statement. Some people do not take care of themselves and do not love their bodies. But he's making a point here. And look what gets quoted in verse 31. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So Paul is quoting Genesis here. Now, there's so much to say about this passage. Let me start with that one first. Because there is one line of thought that says, and this is a legitimate line of thought, that says because Paul quotes Genesis in the New Testament era, that gives more credence to this idea from Genesis about leaving father and mother and being joined together, and this whole concept of one fleshness. This is of special value. So this is in part where you get the idea that has come up through parts of the church through the ages that marriage or sexual relations is of more concern than other issues. So one of the arguments that that we hear in our society today and in the church as well is sometimes Christians say sexual sin is of a different order than any other sin and must be treated more severely. There's a large church locally where this is the exact view of the pastor George had a conversation with this person one day and said, why do you focus so much on sexual sin? And he said, because it's the most destructive sin there is. And therefore, well, okay, so is it more destructive than murder? Or addiction? Yes, it's serious. I'm not saying it's not, but does it rise to a special level above everything else? And this is one of the subtexts that we need to be talking about in the church and in society. If you want to have a conversation that matters, this is an interesting one to talk about. What is it about sexual sin that raises that up to the level that, we can gossip a lot more about sexual sin than we can about someone doing, a whole bunch of other stuff. Pat?
In reading this, in light of what we're going through in the church here, keep going back to so many people think of this marriage, man leaves in place to his wife. But in the relationship of two people who are not man and woman, wife, whatever, I'm just questioning, how does this fit in?
Okay, so here's a great question. And let's touch on that for a moment now. In reading these passages that we've read so far, and we've got some more to come, how do we apply that? So let's say, for the sake of argument, I'm going to put forward a view that some people I've heard expressed, okay? And that view is, I don't have a problem with same-sex relationships, I have a problem with same-sex marriage, because that is a different thing, okay? So hear me, what I'm saying, representing that viewpoint, I'm not advocating for it, I'm saying that is a viewpoint. And in that viewpoint, that is a different starting place than saying all same-sex relationships are wrong. And that is a viewpoint as well. So we're not discussing that viewpoint with this right now. We acknowledge that it's there, but if you come to this, because if you're here, the second question is not relevant, right? But if you're here and you really say, I have no problem with anything except the marriage issue. And I think a lot of folks that I know are in that place, right? And I will tell you, that's where I personally started in this conversation. An interesting note for you as a class is that over the past 12, 13, 15 months that we've been discussing this in our church, there is only one person, literally one person, who's ever asked me what my personal opinion was on this matter. A lot of people have assumed what my opinion was. A lot of people have told other people what my opinion is. There is one person, only one person who's ever asked me. No, it was Don Tittle. Don is the only person who's ever directly asked me what, and he was on the study group, right? We stayed after a meeting one day, and because I had made a statement like this, he said, well, I want to know what your opinion is. So this is where a lot of folks find a struggle in this. And several things that we can say about the language here. One is, there is a school of scholarly research within Christianity that is trying to say, well, the people of Paul's day knew all about same-sex marriage because there was such a thing there. Well, there's scant historical evidence to support that view, right? Yes, we believe there probably were same-sex relationships, but not in the way that we know them today and have known them for in modernity. So that's a different thing. So when Genesis or the New Testament or Paul talks about a man and a woman, one way of looking at this is to say they were speaking to the language of the culture they lived in. And that's the way. It would be like us talking about quesadillas and salsa, and as food staples, right? I'm making a very light comparison here, so pardon me, right? But that's something that it's a language we understand. That's the language that would have fit there. Another way to think of this, and I'm not trying to argue for or against, I'm trying to help you understand the ways people are working through this. How many of you are left-handed? Do we have any left-handed people in the room? Yeah, we have a few. Most all of our instructions for anything when you were in school was geared toward right-handed people, right?
Still is.
Use your right hand to do this and use your left hand to do this. And you had to adapt and use your left hand to do that and your right hand to do this. That wasn't because, well, in some cases it was we were trying to force everyone to be right-handed. But in many cases, it was discussing what the norm is. So the curriculum is written to the norm in that. So there are people who would look at this and say, this is simply describing male and female as what is the prevailing practice. So it's not to say that a relationship that's solemnized in some way as we would a marriage couldn't be something else with two people. In every example we have in Christianity, it's two people, not multiple people, by the way. And that's a question I get asked a lot. I can't think of an example in the New Testament era forward that is positively spoken of in a multi-person relationship. And we'll talk about that some more. Oh my gosh. Okay, well, we're going to extend this into 3 weeks now. That gives you some sense of understanding how to look at this. On the other hand, there are people of good faith who say, I read the Bible and it says a man and a woman, and I believe that's what it means, a man and a woman. And those are the two people who come together in relationship. And that is a valid way of looking at this too. What I want to say to sort of segue to next week, one of the arguments that I hear said is, well, this is, throughout all of history, this is the way marriage has been. I hope that you're beginning to see that there's not one way marriage has been throughout all of history. There certainly is a way that we know marriage that's probably been around since the 18th century. And yes, that is a very long time. It's not from the beginning of time, however. And it's not through even all of Christianity, the Christian era, but it is a very long time, and we need to learn from that, so we can't just throw that away. Don't hear me say that. One of the things I want us to talk about next week as we continue talking through these passages and trying to apply them into our lives today is, if you're in that middle category where you say, okay, I'm fine with a same-sex couple, don't call it marriage, right? And this is a place that I know a lot of people are. If that's you, what are the alternatives? And how might that have come to pass? And I want next week to talk about the history and some of the other options that other countries have come up with. Remember last week we talked about, is marriage something done by the state or by the church or both? And there are multiple examples of places where there are unions that are solemnized by the state apart from the church. It depends on who's got control of it, right? So I want you to think about that as we come back next week. And I, along with dealing with the other questions, will tell you where I've come down on this issue and how I got there along the way. And I think some of you will be surprised because, again, remember, only one person has ever asked me what my opinion is on this. One. A lawyer, of course, right? Okay, we'll pick up next week with Matthew 19, all right? Right.